Hello and welcome to The Wrap, WRAL's weekly podcast where we talk about everything in North Carolina politics. My name is Paul Spey. I'm a state government reporter here with Will Doran, one of our other lead state government reporters, and we're recording this on Friday, December 6th, and we have recently, within the last few minutes, gotten an update in the North Carolina Supreme Court race between Republican Jefferson Griffin and Democrat Allison Riggs. They're separated by about 700 votes, but the race has not been called or certified, whatever you want to say, although Riggs has claimed victory here. And now both sides are deciding to sue each other, or should I say the State Elections Board.
Yes, this is just quickly devolving into a legal battle, and it's probably going to be courts more or less deciding who becomes the next Supreme Court justice here in North Carolina. We had today the state Democratic Party suing the Board of Elections, basically seeking to not allow the GOP strategy of tossing out around 66,000 people's ballots that were cast this year. So like you said, Riggs appears to have won based on both the initial count and the recount showed her up by 700-ish votes in this race. She has declared victory. Griffin has called for a second recount that is underway right now as we speak. Unlikely, just based on past history, that this recount is going to move hundreds and hundreds of votes. And so really his main strategy at this point is this effort to have the State Board of Elections throw out these 60,000 plus ballots that he claims were improperly counted. Now, I know you were at a Wake County Elections Board recently where they took up a few dozen of these, certainly not the whole 60,000, but you reported that they sustained, I think, one.
That's right. Out of about almost 3 dozen ballots, there was only one that they flagged for the state board that may have been ineligible. In other cases, Griffin and other Republicans flagged ballots that they thought were cast by felons, but it turns out there's more than one person with the name, and so
right, just a case of mistaken identity.
Right, things like that. And so, at this point, there have been very few ballots. None have been thrown out. I don't think that would be the word to use, but there have been very few even flagged that need to be held out for the final vote. And why this all matters is that the state Supreme Court makes lots of important rulings on whether it's redistricting or voter ID or lots of things make it up to the high court. And Republicans have control of it. They have 5 out of the 7 seats. Riggs is one of only 2 Democrats. She's an incumbent. And if she loses, it'll be much harder for the Democrats to regain control of the court in 2028 and then 2030. I believe there's another one in 2030. 2026 and 2028.
Correct. Yeah. So, Riggs was up for re-election this year. The court's other Democrat, Anita Earls, is going to be up for re-election in 2026. And then there are 3 Republicans who are up in 2028. So, if the Democrats can defend these seats or even just one of the Riggs and Earls seats, then if they win all 3 of those races in 2028, boom, they take back control of the court before 2030, before the new round of redistricting. That is why national groups have been pouring tens of millions of dollars into our state Supreme Court races over the past years. It's all about redistricting. Now, of course, business groups are also putting money in because they want, certain rulings on their lawsuits, and criminal justice reform advocates have also done the same thing. But the main prize is redistricting and control of Congress.
Right, and so we will be, it looks like, in the legal weeds here for another few weeks, at least based on these lawsuits that came in just moments ago. But the speaking of drama here, this week at the state legislature, lawmakers voted to override Cooper's veto in the state Senate, and his veto of a Hurricane Helene relief bill that Democrats say is not actual relief, that they're just moving money around, but that also strips powers from offices that Democrats just won. in the elections this year. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this bill, like you said, it officially is a Helene relief bill, but the main purpose of the bill is to push through a whole host of conservative priorities before the Republicans lose their veto-proof supermajority coming in January. And, that includes some policy changes to environmental rules, things like that. But the big ones are stripping power away from the governor, the attorney general, and then a couple other offices that Democrats also flipped in this year's elections, the superintendent of schools and lieutenant governor. But the main targets are the governor and the AG. And, we've got incoming Governor Josh Stein, just won by 15 points. I mean, that's the biggest margin of victory in a governor's race since, I think, 1980.
It was the 80s.
Yeah. Jeff Jackson won by 3 points in the race for AG. That's not, a ground swell 15-point victory like Stein had, but it is the biggest margin of victory in an AG's race.
Right. No recount needed there.
Right. And, won by 3 points even in a state that Trump won. So Democrats say that, look, these people clearly have the mandate of the voters. Popular will is behind them. People did not vote for them hoping or believing that they wouldn't have any power when they come into office. People voted for them because they wanted them to exercise the powers of these offices. Well, Republicans say, not if we have any say about it. And they have multiple ways that they are thinking of taking power away from these offices. Now, I should note, Republicans have already taken a ton of power away from the governor. I mean, this started back in 2016.
Weak governor by comparison to other states.
Yeah, so this has been going on for the last 8 years, ever since Roy Cooper beat Pat McCrory. A lot of the changes in this one are actually focused on the AG's office, which hasn't been targeted as heavily in the past.
Let's go over just a couple of examples of some of the powers they're taking away. I know I was looking into it. One thing they're taking away from the governor is during states of emergency, they're taking away some of his powers. One thing that Governor Cooper did after Helene hit North Carolina was enhance unemployment benefits for people in those 25 disaster-affected areas. Well, what that looked like is instead of getting $300 a week, you could qualify for up to $600 or so per week. Well, this bill would strip him of that power. Republicans don't like and don't think they don't think he actually ever had the legal authority to do that, and so they're clarifying the law to say, hey, no more of that for you. And that goes into effect after the current state of emergency ends. But, some people may see that as a big deal. It could mean less money for people who need it on unemployment. What does it do with the Attorney General?
The Attorney General would be banned from arguing that any state laws are unconstitutional. And that's a big one. We've seen both Cooper and Stein, when they've been the Attorney General, argue this, mostly related to voter ID and abortion laws were some of the big ones. But, anything in the future that comes up, Jeff Jackson would not be allowed to say, I believe that this is unconstitutional and should be overturned.
Right. He basically has to side with them.
Yes. And even more than that, to your point, in any court case that the legislature is in, he would not be allowed to have an opinion that is different from the legislature's opinions.
Interesting.
So, you can't have the AG and the legislature on different sides of a case, essentially, which, that could raise some separation of powers questions. I'm sure that should this pass, that's going to get sued over. There's plenty of stuff in this that's going to get sued over if it passes. Another thing it does for both the governor and the AG really takes away the power over the Utilities Commission, which regulates Duke Energy. Basically in exchange for being allowed to have a monopoly over electricity in North Carolina, Duke agrees to be regulated by the state through the Utilities Commission. The board would currently the governor has the majority of people on the Utilities Commission. This would switch it over to Republican appointees would be in the majority, and it would also strip away the AG's ability to automatically intervene essentially on behalf of customers, ratepayers, whenever Duke asks for a rate increase. So currently, whenever Duke says, hey, I want to increase rates, and Utilities Commission votes yes or no, the AG can step in and say, hey, I don't think this is good. The AG would no longer have that power. I asked Governor Roy Cooper about this recently, and he said, gee, I wonder who advocated for this change. So, there's clearly, some behind the scenes work going into this. Again, lots of this is going to get sued over if it passes. For right now, that's a big if, because when this originally passed in the House, there were 3 Republicans who sided with the Democrats and voted against this.
Right.
And Republicans do not have that kind of cushion for their supermajority. If even one of those 3 skips this veto override or continues holding out, it's not going to pass unless you've got a ton of Democrats who are absent next week. And so, there's some pressure on those 3 Republicans to kind of continue holding out. They're all of them are from Western North Carolina, and none of them have publicly said why they voted against it, but you can kind of read between the lines and assume it was because of the Helene pieces, or rather the lack thereof in the bill. GOP leaders have said that they fully expect all 3 of them to come back on board, and even talking to Democrats, they kind of do see this as a foregone conclusion. So it does seem that this will be something that is decided by the courts, and whether that includes Allison Riggs or Jefferson Griffin in the future, who knows? But it's going there.
Now, people may wonder, why attach Helene relief funding, or even call it that, when it includes all this other stuff? And I imagine, if I put my political strategist hat on, it's so that when they vote against it, when Democrats vote against it, you can use that in future political ads against Democratic candidates and say, oh, so-and-so voted against Helene relief. And what else was in this bill specifically for Helene? We heard the governor say that it moves money around and doesn't really help that much. Is that the case?
Yeah, there were a few policy changes aimed at, kind of helping people on the ground, but in terms of actual money that was being spent, the main thing that it did was take $277 million from just kind of a general savings reserve and stick it in a Helene-specific savings reserve. So that's not money that's going to get immediately spent. Some of it did get appropriated out. They spent $50 million on rebuilding homes, which is obviously not nothing. It's also much, much less than Governor Cooper has said is needed. But $50 million is not nothing. So, you can't say that this bill does nothing for Western North Carolina, but it's really just a drop in the bucket. But really, no matter what the state does, whether it's, Cooper's plan of almost $4 billion in spending that he's laid out, or the legislature, which so far has approved less than $900 million, whatever happens in the end, it's going to be the federal government that picks up the main chunk of the bill for these damages. I'm
so glad you brought that up, because this past Sunday you had a big story about what that might look like, and just sort of the politics that goes on there. And we've seen people on both sides of the aisle say, we need help from the federal government. The state cannot do all of bail out these victims here in Western North Carolina. And now we see even Senator Tom Tillis and others in D.C. calling on their Republican colleagues to pass some sort of relief bill. Can you tell us what that looks like?
Yeah. So while we've got all of this infighting here in Raleigh that we've been talking about, which is pretty intense. I mean, the legislature is at a level of tension that I have not seen in quite some time.
Right. We forgot to mention that this week when they passed the Senate voted on that bill that stripped powers from the governor, there were people kicked out of the gallery for interrupting and things like that.
Yeah. There's protests, and even just between the lawmakers themselves. I mean, there's just kind of this, the kumbaya that we had immediately after Helene when they came together and did things unanimously is long gone. But up in D.C., there does seem to be some bipartisanship on this. Both Roy Cooper and Josh Stein have been in D.C. recently, meeting with Tom Tillis and Ted Budd, who are Republicans. Cooper met one-on-one with Biden in the Oval Office to make a pitch for more funding. And what we've seen is Biden has put out a plan for around $100 million in disaster relief. And that wouldn't only go to North Carolina. That would go to a dozen or more states hit by Helene and Milton and Debbie and, other storms that hit Alaska and tornadoes in the Midwest. I mean, the money would be going all over the place.
That doesn't sound like enough based on what we said Cooper's estimate was earlier.
Correct. And so that's why they've been up in D.C. talking with Biden and talking with these lawmakers saying, look, North Carolina needs $25 billion from the federal government. Just North Carolina.
With a B.
With a B. So if you're only going to spend $100 billion on disaster relief for 12,
100
15,
million, you mean, yeah.
100 billion.
Oh, okay.
But for 12 or 15 states, suddenly that, that pot of money starts to look smaller and smaller. So we've seen even Republicans seem to be on board in Congress with Biden's plan for this $100 billion. The big question is whether they're going to be on board with this plan that Tom Tillis is pitching, that Ted Budd is pitching, that Roy Cooper is pitching, that, hey, we need even more than what Biden is proposing. I don't know how that's going to go over in Congress, but we should know by the end of the year, and probably even before Christmas, because the federal government is going to shut down by December 20th, I believe, or 21st, unless Congress can figure out some sort of spending bill to get us past the self-imposed deadline that they've put on themselves. And so probably in the next week or so, we will see some movement on this spending plan in Congress, and we'll know more when they decide how much they actually want to spend.
It comes at such a weird time because, like you said, on one hand, they need to pass a spending bill to keep the government open. And on the other hand, we have President-elect Donald Trump, who has allies in Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, who are looking into government efficiency, or they would say inefficiency, and trying to cut waste. So who knows? It's hard to gauge the appetite of people in D.C. to spend more, billions and billions more, to help one state or a couple of states. We're up against the break. When we come back, we'll talk more about what legislators did down at the Capitol in Raleigh. Stay with us. Welcome back to The Wrap. I'm Paul Spey, here with Will Doran. We're talking about the week in politics in North Carolina. We've already touched on the poison pill Helene relief bill that included provisions that would strip powers away from Democratic officials in the governor's and attorney general's offices. The Senate overrode Cooper's veto on that. We're still waiting to see if the House will do the same. But that's not the only thing state lawmakers did in Raleigh this week. They're also talking about more constitutional amendments. And I say more because we just had a constitutional amendment on the ballot that said, hey, if you're not a legal citizen of the United States, you can't participate in our elections. It was already the case, but they put it on there again. What are they talking about now?
Yeah, these are kind of the same theme of amendments that, if they pass, won't immediately actually change anything, just like that citizen voting amendment that we had. And so, you could look at it as just, Republicans recognize that probably 2026 is going to be a rough midterm year for them. I mean, historically, whichever party is in the White House always has trouble in the midterms. And so they're putting these two amendments on the ballot that are going to be good for boosting conservative turnout. One would be for voter ID. Another would be for tax cuts. And if those sound familiar to you, it's because we already did them back in 2018. Now, it's different versions that they're proposing now. They're both a little bit stricter than the versions that we passed in 2018, but for the most part, it's the exact same theme, the same proposal, just kind of going another step.
And tell us why, briefly here, it sounds like they can pass laws that do these things. What's the benefit of etching it into the Constitution?
Yeah, that is a great question. What that does is, one, it makes it harder for courts to rule it unconstitutional because it is literally constitutional. And two, it makes it harder for future legislatures to undo. Because when you want to pass a law, you only need 50% of the legislature plus the governor, or a supermajority if you don't have the governor on board, to actually make that law. But if something's in the Constitution and you want to pass a new law getting around that, you've got to change the Constitution, which requires having 60% of the legislature plus 50% of the voting public agreeing to what you want to do. And so Republicans are saying, okay, when we came in, the state's maximum income tax rate was capped at 10%. When we put an amendment on the ballot in 2018 to move that down to 7%, that got pretty broad support. And they're proposing now this new amendment would further lower that to 5%.
And the current rate is below 5 already. It's like 4.25, right, or 4.2.
Correct. So this wouldn't immediately lower anybody's taxes, but it would stop, say, for example, if Democrats were to take back the legislature in 6-8 years, whatever, this would make it much, much, much harder for Democrats to raise taxes on rich people and corporations like they often say that they want to do. They could only raise those up as high as 5%, whereas, prior to 2018, they could have raised it to as high as 10%.
And so we would see these if they put these constitutional amendments up to a vote, that would be on the ballot in a future election.
In 2026, correct. So it could help, get Republicans out to the polls in an election when, just looking at historical trends, you're probably anticipating that it's going to be a blue wave like 2018, which was why those amendments were on the ballot then as well.
I'm detecting a theme here. They're already thinking about 2026 with this Helene bill that has a lot of stuff Democrats don't like. They're going to force them to vote against it. And now they're thinking about 2026 again and how they can get people to show up to vote. I think that goes to show politicking and elections never stop, especially in North Carolina.
It never stops.
And I would add another criticism of the idea of capping the income tax, while popular among many people, is that I believe I saw economists say, like, well, what happens if there's a huge disaster or recession and we need more revenue to keep the state going? Capping it at 5% would limit their options.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you would just have to cut spending at that point because, especially if there was a recession, there's no way that people are going to vote to raise their taxes.
Right.
So, yeah, that would just necessitate cuts to government spending, which, of course, is a policy that Republicans want to pass, and they control government. They have every right to put this on the ballot right now.
Right. Well, Republicans are thinking ahead to 2026, and so are Democrats, so it would seem. This week, also in Raleigh at the legislature, Democrats in the state Senate voted to have a new minority leader, in Sydney Batch. Can you tell us about her and about who she replaced?
Yes, Sydney Batch. She is a Wake County Democrat from the Holly Springs area, and not new to the legislature, but certainly new relative to Dan Blue, the Senate leader who she's replacing, who has been an institution in the state legislature for decades. He was the Speaker of the House previously, the first and still only Black Speaker of the House ever in North Carolina. Has been the Senate leader for years. He's just, very much an institution down on Jones Street. But Democrats decided that it was time for some fresh blood. And, you've done reporting on this as well. There hasn't been a lot of folks willing to really peel back the layers here on all of the palace intrigue that went into this, I don't want to call it a coup, but this effort to change the leadership. But, I think it kind of goes in the same trend as everything that we've seen in national politics. Joe Biden not seeking re-election, maybe not entirely, his own decision, stepping aside for Kamala Harris. The state Democratic Party, ousting their, older chairwoman in favor of Anderson Clayton, 20-something activist. There seems to be very much a push in the Democratic Party right now for younger blood and fresh faces in top positions.
Those are great comparisons, especially the one to the state Democratic Party. And I would venture to guess that this year's election played a role in it. I don't know if that's the case, but right now it certainly appears that Democrats broke the Republican supermajority in the House, but did not, and we know they did not, in the state Senate. And so if you're, say, a Senate Democrat, and you're looking, down the hall, and you're like, well, they were able to achieve their goal, and we could not. Let's bring in someone new. When we got that press release, I did call Senator Blue, and he acknowledged that he was intending to, come back and be the minority leader, but that he had heard that there was a desire for a change. And so, as he put it, he took the temperature of the room, or the caucus, and in the end decided not to put his name in the hat. And so when they had this vote, his name was not on the ballot, so to speak. I don't know if there was a ballot. That's very secretive. But Batch had already secured the votes she needed to take his job.
Yeah, yeah. And, I should note as well, she is the first woman to lead the Senate Democrats, or I think any Senate caucus possibly ever. My understanding is the records on this aren't, great. Certainly the first in a long time. And the Democrats in the Senate, it's actually a majority female caucus. That building as a whole, anyone who's ever been down in the legislature knows, is very much a boys' club.
Yep.
But the Senate Democrats specifically are majority women, and so electing a woman as their leader, makes a lot of sense.
And we should say the press release about this mentioned that there was no hostility in this. Blue wishes her well. When I spoke to him on the phone, he said he thinks this move will strengthen the caucus. Now they're united behind Batch. It'll be interesting to see what he does next. But it certainly seems like they have their eyes on 2026 as well and improving their numbers. And it's also a style change. Blue is sort of he's well regarded there, obviously, and Batch, at least in the eyes of Republicans, they don't see her necessarily as a negotiator. She's viewed by Republicans as more combative than Blue is. So it'll be interesting to see how they get along. Speaking of leadership roles, you may have heard President-elect Donald Trump picked a North Carolina native to be the Secretary for the Army. Daniel Driscoll is a Boone native and UNC graduate like yourself, Will Doran.
Go Heels.
And he's a former Army officer who graduated from Yale Law School and went into venture capital, and apparently is tied to Vice President J.D. Vance. So that's interesting to watch it.
Yeah, J.D. Vance, also a Yale Law grad and veteran, so clearly they had stuff to connect with there. He obviously is from North Carolina. North Carolina is the home to the biggest Army base, I think biggest military base in the world, in Fort Liberty. So any sort of decisions on the Army are going to really affect North Carolina. And Trump made a point of pointing out that he was a North Carolinian when he announced this pick. So, he wants people at Fort Liberty and elsewhere to know that it is a North Carolina guy in Dan Driscoll who's going to be leading the Pentagon.
And we should mention, too, that Vance was here today, Friday, touring some of the wreckage from Helene. And so we'll see. We'll see if that makes a difference and whether or not our state gets more federal funding. That about does it for the week in politics in North Carolina, which is almost always a wild ride. Join us next week when we'll go over more craziness.